How are you guys doing? Today is Friday, January 7th, 2022. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an individual profile on Lamar Jackson. The elite starting quarterback for the Baltimore Ravens turns 25 today. And for this episode, of course, I'm going to point out how he has been able to impact the NFL and football as a whole on a micro level as we look at every single game that he's been a part of as both a passer and a runner. And not to mention what he's been doing on a macro level and how he's impacted the game in a sense. Lamar Jackson is one of the few players that I can easily objectively say has changed the way that football is being played. He's a very talented player who's basically risen up to criticism and basically shattered expectations at every single level. If you're unfamiliar with how he plays, he stands at about 6'2", 212, or he stands about 212. So he's about shorter than you would guess like a pocket passer to be, and that he's probably smaller than a lot of bigger quarterbacks in the NFL, but he is incredibly shifty, he's incredibly athletic, he's incredibly brilliant, he knows his body, he knows his teammates, and he just has a good sense for being a good football player. And he just knows how to win games. You don't become the youngest player to win the MVP in the NFL by accident. And of course, I'm going to get into what makes Lamar Jackson one of the best talents that the NFL has ever seen. So, originally coming out of Pompano Beach, Florida, he will go on to play high school football in Florida. So you get a sense of how competitive the atmosphere is, because Florida is definitely one of those states that really takes high school sports, especially high school football, incredibly seriously. He would end up going to play at Louisville as a starting quarterback because of many questions were made about his ability to throw the ball, because of course no one was questioning his ability to run a ball into the end zone, but of course those are the questions, and of course people still have those today, but of course you're going to have your haters. Going into his freshman season, he would have to earn his starting spot with the team. In 2015, which would go on to be Lamar Jackson's age 18 season, he would go on to play 12 games as he started 8 of them. This would also be a season where Louisville would finish with a 8-5 record in their second season in the ACC. This is when Bobby Petrino was the coach. They would go all the way to the Music City Bowl, where they would end up winning that matchup by about 6 games over Texas A&M. This is when Lamar Jackson was named the MVP of that bowl game, but in the season itself, he would end up completing 55% of his passes as he threw for 1,840 yards, 12 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions. On the ground, he would go on to run for 960 yards and 11 touchdowns. That would go on to, of course, be 2,800 total yards of offense and 23 touchdowns. And of course, following that 2015 season, he was at least recognized as one of the better up-and-coming starters. Wasn't necessarily given a title yet, but of course, he would start receiving accolades just his second year at Louisville. In his sophomore season at Louisville in 2016, which was his age 19 season, Lamar Jackson will go on to start 13 games in a season where the Louisville Cardinals would go on to finish with a 21st record, with the 21st best team, 21st best team in the nation. They finished with a 9-4 record. They went all the way to the Citrus Bowl. They would end up losing in this matchup to LSU by about 20. This was when Darius Geis was the running back for LSU. But going into Lamar Jackson's sophomore season, through the air, he would go on to he would complete 56% of his passes for 3,543 passing yards, 30 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. He ran on the ground for 1,571 rushing yards, as he had 21 touchdowns on the ground. His 21 touchdowns were the most rushing touchdowns he's had in a year at Louisville. He, of course, would go on to combine for over 5,000 yards of offense as a sophomore, as he combined for 51 total touchdowns as well as 9 interceptions. In the 2016 season, he would be awarded the Heisman Trophy, which is, of course, given to the best player in all of college football. He was given the Maxwell Award, which is given to the college football, or the best all-around player. He was given the Walter Camp Award, which is given to the best offensive player. He was given the Associated Press Player of the Year. He was the ACC Athlete of the Year. He was the ACC Player of the Year, of course, after making first team All-ACC. He would be named the ACC Offensive Player of the Year, and in 2016, this was the lone season in which he was named a unanimous All-American. So, of course, he would be named all of this in a season in which he combined for over 5,000 yards and 50 touchdowns while leading Louisville to a season where they finished as a ranked team. And then, of course, this now leads us to Lamar Jackson's third and final season of eligibility at Louisville, which would be his age 20 season in 2017. In that season, he would go on to start all 13 of the games he played in a season where the Cardinals would finish with an 8-5 record. They would end up finishing the season unranked as they ended up losing in the Tax Slayer Bowl to Mississippi State by 4 points. Even though he lost, Lamar Jackson was named one of the MVPs in the game. But taking a look at how his collegiate career would end in his junior year, he would end up completing 59% of his passes, which was a career high. He threw for 3,660 yards and 27 touchdowns, as well as 10 interceptions. His 3,600 passing yards would be the most passing yards he had in a year. His 10 interceptions were the most interceptions he had in a year, but by 1. And in that, on the ground, he would run for 1,601 yards, as he would go on to combine for over 5,200 yards of offense, and he had 18 touchdowns on the ground, so he combined for 45. His junior season would see him having 6 less total touchdowns than the previous year, but of course, he had more yards of total offense. And at the conclusion of the 2017 season, Lamar Jackson was named to the first team ACC, as he was named the ACC Offensive Player of the Year and the ACC Player of the Year for the second year in a row. Following that year, at the top of the 2018 year, he was named the ACC Athlete of the Year. And following that year, he would be going into the draft. After having such an amazing career as a quarterback, of course, many combine scouts wanted to see him run as a receiver or as a running back, to which he said he wasn't going to. He actually opted out of the 40-yard dash for that very reason. And he would go on to be taken with the 32nd overall pick in the 2018 NFL Draft by the Baltimore Ravens. Taking a look at the other players that were taking a look at the other players that were taken in the first round of this draft pick. The first quarterback taken in this draft was Baker Mayfield out of Oklahoma. Saquon Barkley, the elite running back for the New York Giants, was selected out of Penn State. Denzel Ward was taken by the Cleveland Browns out of Ohio State, the newly elite cornerback, at least on my list. Josh Allen, the elite starting quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, was drafted out of Wyoming with the 7th overall pick, as he was the third quarterback taken in this draft. Minkah Fitzpatrick was drafted out of Alabama to the Dolphins. Now he's on the Steelers. Tremaine Edmonds was taken with the 16th pick to go to the Buffalo Bills. Derwin James went with the 17th overall pick to the Los Angeles Chargers, just to get a sense of the players that were taken ahead of him. Nick Chubb was taken 3 picks after him by the Cleveland Browns, and Darius Leonard was the next pick, so you get a sense of all of the talent that was taken around him, especially in this draft. So from the 2018 draft, at least until this day, Lamar Jackson has been the starting quarterback for the Baltimore Ravens. But of course, in his rookie season, he would have to earn his way up. He would go on to start 7 of the 16 games he played in his rookie season in his age 21 season with the Ravens. As a starter, he would finish with a 6-1 record in a season where the Ravens would go on to finish with a 10-6 record. So of course, without him, that is a 4-5 record. So if I'm doing my math correctly. In the 16 games he played, in the 7 games he started, he would go on to complete 58% of his passes, as he threw for 1,200 yards. He also threw for 6 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. On the ground, he would run for nearly 700 yards and 5 touchdowns as he would finish with about 1,900 yards and 11 touchdowns on the season. He would help the Baltimore Ravens eventually make the playoffs, and by the time the season ended, he was the starting quarterback. And in their very first playoff game, they would end up losing that wild card game to the San Diego Chargers. But of course, that's how that season fared. But by the end of that first season, he would earn his way up to becoming a starter. And then going into his second year was what set Lamar Jackson apart from almost any quarterback that's ever played the game. And in my opinion, any quarterback, considering they wanted him to be a running back. In Lamar Jackson's second season with the Baltimore Ravens and his age 22 season in 2019, remind you, 22, in a league where players are violently trying to rip each other's heads off, Lamar Jackson would start 15 games in a season where the Baltimore Ravens would finish with a 14-2 record. They would go on to win the AFC North, and in the 15 games he played, Lamar Jackson finished with a 13-2 record as the starter. He would complete a career-high 66% of his passes, as he would throw for 3,128 yards. On the ground, he would go on to run for 1,206. That's 4,300 total yards of offense. He would go on to lead the National League in touchdown passes, specifically touchdown passes. He threw 36 touchdowns against 6 interceptions. And then he would also go on to run for 7 touchdowns of his own. That's 43 total touchdowns attributed to him. He also led the league in QBR as well. And like I said, having 6 touchdowns in 15 games started while leading the Ravens to the best record in the AFC. That's pretty tough to argue. And in his second year in the NFL, in his first year as a starter, as a 22-year-old who was told to be a running back, he would go on to not only make his very first Pro Bowl, he was named to the first team All-NFL in 2019, and he would go on to be named the NFL's most valuable player. He's the youngest player in NFL history to be named the NFL MVP. And once the Ravens would go on to make the playoffs, they would end up losing in that very first matchup to the Tennessee Titans. But also looking at what went down that year, Greg Roman would be named the assistant coach of the year right before he went on to, that was how he fared. And then John Harbaugh would be named the coach of the year. So that's how the 2019 season finished, even though they ended up losing in the divisional rounds. But this transitions into Lamar Jackson's third full season as a starting quarterback. And in his age 23 season, he would go on to start 15 games for a Ravens team that in 2020 finished with an 11-5 record. They finished with the second best record in their division. But looking at how Lamar fared in the season right after his MVP, he would complete 64% of his passes as he threw for 2,757 yards, 26 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. On the ground, he would, of course, go on to run for 1,000 yards. This would be the second time in his NFL career he's ran for 1,000 yards. Not to mention that in his MVP season, he would break the record for most rushing yards by a quarterback in a season. But still, in 2020, he would go on to be the first quarterback in NFL history, I believe, to have rushed for over 1,000 yards in multiple seasons while still throwing for what he did. So, of course, he really kind of sets himself apart as a dual threat in a class of his own. With his 1,000 yards on the ground, he would finish with over 3,700 total yards of offense. And then, of course, when you add in his 7 rushing touchdowns, which is a career high, he goes on to combine for 33 touchdowns on the year. In 2020, Lamar Jackson was not named to a Pro Bowl, but he did lead the Ravens to the playoffs. Once the Ravens made the playoffs, they would end up beating the Titans in the very first round by a touchdown before they ended up losing in the divisional round. They lost 17-3 at Buffalo to the Bills. Following that matchup, the Bills would go on and lose in the AFC Championship to the Steelers, who lost in the Super Bowl to the Buccaneers in Tampa Bay. So that is, of course, how the 2020 season ended, and this leads us to this current season where Lamar Jackson's currently playing. So far, he started 12 games in a season where the Ravens are sitting sitting with an 8-8 record, just on the bubble of the playoff picture. With a win versus the Steelers, I guess they would have to wait for a lot of other things. They would need a lot of other things to necessarily happen, but a win versus the Steelers would most definitely help them. Lamar Jackson is still listed as questionable, as he has been dealing with a lot of injuries this season. I mean, the entire Ravens staff has. Specifically this season, Lamar has been dealing with shoulder stuff. He's been dealing with ankle stuff as well. Right now, his current injury is an ankle injury, as he's still probable, and many people are waiting with bated breath to see if he actually returns. But looking at how he's fared so far this season, he's had a 7-5 starting record. I even went to one of the games he went to versus the Indianapolis Colts, where he came back from behind, one of the best games that I ever went to. And in that game, he would tie Troy Aikman for the most wins in an NFL career before he turned 25. So far this year, he has gone on to complete 64% of his passes, just like he did last season. He's thrown for 2,882 passing yards. On the ground so far, he's ran for about 767 and a couple of touchdowns. So he has 3,600 total yards of offense. And then when you add in his 2 touchdowns, he has 18 touchdowns total against a career high 13 interceptions. Nonetheless, this season, he's proven that with his depleted roster, he is very impactful on a Baltimore Ravens team that would not be sitting on the bubble if not for him. In 2021, this season, he was named a Pro Bowler for the second time in his NFL career. But since the season is not officially over, I do not have any accolades or playoff results to give you. But I know that by this time next year, I will have a full season recorded, at least by then, to give you to account for this 2021 season. But with that said, I want to first thank the NFL and college football reference websites for giving me all the facts and the figures that I needed for this episode. I, of course, want to thank everybody for listening to all 16, 17 minutes of this piece. I do hope all is well. If you ever get a chance, I would recommend watching Lamar Jackson. I do think he is the future of football. The fact that he's been able to change the narrative, change how the game is played, and give and open offenses up to having their quarterbacks be dual threats if defenses are getting too conservative. I think that Lamar Jackson is definitely a very impactful player that when he's done and his career is over, he can look back and see the work that he's done. But especially where we are right now is a very impressive indicator of where he is as he's turning 25, as he's entering his prime years. Of course, he's not going to be running the ball this much forever, as he does become a better pocket passer and does get a better sense of his team around him. I just think that where we are right now, it would be asinine if I didn't include Lamar Jackson amongst the best players, even now or just to ever play the game. With that said, thanks for listening to my piece. I hope all is well. And once all of today's exhibitions and matchups are done, I'm going to come back tomorrow on Saturday, January 8th for another episode. And hopefully by January 7th, 2023, I'll have more to say about Lamar. Thanks for listening. I hope all is well. And I'll catch you with another piece right after this. Peace out.